In our video number 10 today, we will learn about the effects of the new economic policy 1991. In our previous video, we looked at the introduction of the new economic policy, and under the new economic policy, we introduced the LP and G, liberalization, privatization and globalization. In this video, let us look at the performance of the Indian economy during the reform period. Now, when we said liberalization, we moved on from the closed economy to open economy. So this meant that we had connections now with the world market, or we were also a part of the world market now. Then under liberalization, import licensing was abolished, except for the hazardous and environmentally sensitive industries. Then quantitative restrictions were also removed, which meant that goods and agricultural products were fully available. Then export duties was also removed to increase the competitive position of the Indian goods in the international markets. Then came privatization. Under this, more importance was given to the private sector, and the private sector also could manufacture certain products that were now produced by the public sector units, and the public sector units, certain public sector units were also privatized, and we learned this as disinvestment. They were sold away to the private industrialists. Then under globalization, we had access to global markets now, since we opened our economy under liberalization, and we could get more technology into the country. And the most important aspect of globalization was outsourcing. So it provided employment to the domestic people. When you look into the statistics of the contribution to the GDP in percentages from the various sectors, we find that the agricultural sector in 1980 to 91 contribution was only 3.6%. Whereas after the introduction of the new economic policy 1991, we found a reduction in its contribution, and finally to minus 0.2% in the year 2014 and 15. This could be attributed to many factors, like the fall in investment on the infrastructure, that is irrigation, power, roads, etc., which form the infrastructure in the agricultural sector. And the subsidies for fertilizers was also removed. And then the international competition increased. And then the export-oriented policy. Under this policy, farmers preferred to produce cash crops rather than the production of food grains. Right? So that was maybe one of the contributions that led to a reduction in the agricultural contribution to the GDP. Then if we come to the industrial sector, we find that in 1980-91, before the introduction of the new economic policy, it was 77.1%, which though reduced a little bit in 1992-2001, but it picked up and it rose to 9% and then fell to 5.9% due to various reasons, which could be due to increase in the cheaper imports and lower investment in the industrial sectors. Now, if you look at the services sector, its contribution was 6.7% before the introduction of NEP, but later on it increased to 8.2, 10 and 10.3%. So, our services sector saw a gradual increase in the contribution to the GDP. Now, we learned when can we call a country a developed country is when the contribution from the agricultural sector in comparison to the industrial and the services sector is lower. Our services sector should be the greatest, should be greater than the industrial and the agricultural sectors. If you look at the total contribution from 1980-91 to 2014-15, we find there a constant increase in the percentage contribution to the GDP per annum. Now, what is the point to be noted over here is, though the GDP increased, it did not generate enough employment opportunities. Now, such a situation where employment does not increase, but contribution to the GDP is increasing without the improvement in any employment, is called a jobless growth. It is called a jobless growth. Now, when you come to the industrial sector, there has been some positive effect of the LPG, and we were successful in exporting auto parts, engineering goods, IT software, textiles, etc. However, there was a negative effect of this globalization too, and that was that the availability of cheap imported goods, because import was now available, and then the lower investment in infrastructure. Infrastructure facilities include power supply, which remained inadequate due to lack of investment. Then non-access to markets in the developed nations or developed countries. See, although all quota restrictions on exports of textiles and clothing have been removed in India, countries like USA have not yet removed their quota restriction on import of textiles from India and China. The urban concentration of growth process. Industries have focused only on the urban areas than the rural areas. So what happens is this further widens the rural urban divide. Then you can say that it is a lopsided affair or a lopsided growth process. Why? Because it is not inclusive growth process. Why not inclusive? Because it does not include all the sectors of the economy. If it is a very fair kind of a thing, then all the sectors, the agricultural, industrial, as well as services sectors should grow together. But here we find the urban areas are showing growth when compared to the rural areas. So, and moreover, the services sector has shown a drastic improvement in its contribution to the GDP. Then there is also a major concern of the negative effect of the globalization, which is cultural erosion. Now, economic prosperity has taken a lead over all the other parameters of life that we understand. Now, everybody wants to be independent and well off, and the family and the society take a back seat. So, that's one concern of the cultural erosion. Coming to the services sector, we saw that there has been a continuous increase in the percentage contribution to the GDP, 10.3% of the growth rate. This could be attributed to foreign direct investment and the foreign investment FIIs from 100 million US dollars in 1990-91 to 36 billion US dollars in 2016-17. Then, foreign exchange reserves was one of the reasons for the government to shift to LPG policies. And a good amount of forex reserves enhance economic confidence in the global investors in the Indian markets. You know, and the foreign exchange reserves have increased from 6 billion US dollars in 1990-91 to 321 US dollars in 2014-15. And very recently, in May 2020, the foreign exchange reserves increased to 500 billion US dollars. Now, apart from this positive effect, we also had a negative impact of the LPGs. What were they? They were that there was limited public expenditure, and reduction in taxes also did not increase the government revenue. Government earns its revenue only through taxes. So if you reduce the taxes, the government revenue also reduces. Limited public expenditure would mean that there would be less social welfare now because of the introduction of the private sector also. Then there was a reduction in the tariff. When tariff rates are reduced, the government also reduces its revenue. Then tax incentives were given for those industries which would establish themselves in rural areas or backward regions. But since these tax incentives were given, this further reduced the revenue to the government. And the government could not address problems like employment, agriculture, industry, infrastructure development, and fiscal management. So these were the negative impacts on the developmental and welfare. So what to do and where to go? We must see that we do not surrender to big players in the international markets. We saw, this is a game of the developed countries where they would try to find markets in the developing countries. So it's our responsibility to look into this, not to give any uh, place to these big players, which would, swallow up the domestic industries. And then not to neglect the domestic producers. Now, in to favor the import, or to show off, we buy imported goods which are cheaper than the domestic goods. But it's very important to look into our domestic industries and domestic markets also, so that we can flourish at least in our country and our domestic industries are protected. Then channelize the foreign direct investment more into infrastructure rather than retail trading, or let us say fast food junctions like KFC and Domino's. So we must see that we do not encourage these kind of retail trading of the FDIs. Rather than, we must see that we concentrate these FDIs more into the infrastructure development, because that would help us grow altogether. To wind up, let's look at a critical evaluation of the new economic policy. The positive impact is evident because there was a substantial increase in the level of the economic activity and also a sustained rise in the GDP. Then the negative impact is there has been a sectoral imbalance and the concentration of the economic power. And the agricultural sector suffered, and the industrial sector and the tertiary sectors have gained a momentum. The growth process was largely confined to the urban sector of the economy. So, those were the critical review of the new economic policy.